Hello, so we are starting the sessions for the seventh week on this course on managing services and contemporary issues. We are going to discuss in this session and possibly the next session service quality. This is a very interesting and strategic topic. The reason is that, as we have number of times discussed, service businesses are today hyper competitive. The entry barrier is usually low in service business, so service business has always been prone to tough competition. So the more you succeed, the more competitors you attract. But today, these competition is coming not only from your regional or national domain, but competitions in the service field are often coming from all over the world. And certain types of services, like for example, say mobile services or medical services or certain types of information and communication technology oriented services, software services, these are today born global. That means you start competing in the global arena right from day one. As a result, in this hyper competitive, globally competitive arena of services business, the most important asset is customer, and just having customers is not enough. You need to have repeat customers. You need to have customer loyalty. Even customer loyalty is not good enough today. What you really need for competitive advantage or to stand out is customer advocacy. We have discussed this a number of times. As you see in this diagram at the back, the foundation is customer satisfaction. There is a correlation between customer satisfaction and service quality. If your service quality is poor, then you don't even get to play in the satisfaction arena. But just customer satisfaction is not enough, because there are many instances where if you ask the customer as the customer is coming out of the service factory or the service shop or the place of delivery of service, be it a movie auditorium, be it a restaurant, be it some kind of personal care service, salon. If you ask the customer that were you satisfied, the customer might say, yes, I was quite satisfied. That does not mean that the customer will come back to that establishment. Repeat business is not ensured by customer just being satisfied. Repeat business is ensured if customer, in comparison to competition, is delighted with your service, and then you have what we call customer preference. And today customer preference, until and unless you get customer advocacy, is really of not that much value. In many fields today, for example, whenever I go to on any trip, be it a conference trip or a business trip or a leisure tourism trip, I first use various hotel and travel related sites to use their filters. So be it hotels.com or booking.com or makemytrip.com or goibibo.com, I use Trivago, I use their comparative services, I use the filters, and then come to maybe 5 or 6 hotels of my choice. The next thing that I do is I don't read what the hotels are talking about, their facilities or how great they are. I straight away read the comments from other customers. And now these days it is almost compulsory in these days of ubiquitous social media that almost all of these sites, they list customers' comments, customers' ratings for the services. So I read those comments, and based on those comments, I often make my decision for hotel X instead of hotel Y or Z or MNOP, which means that customer advocacy or co-opting the customer for your marketing has now become almost mandatory for many services. And the journey to win that status in customers' mind, the journey to win that advocacy level, going from the level of customer satisfaction to customer preference to customer advocacy, depends on the journey starts with service quality. So the idea of customer preference is correlated with service quality. The data for service quality, which is fundamentally to be used for comparison between service establishment A and service establishment B, or for comparison within that quality assessment model itself, which we are going to discuss just now, the data collection starts from what we call at the touch points, starts from the moments of truth, where the customer comes in contact with the frontline service personnel and the frontline service facilities. So this each customer contact is actually an input into our service quality evaluation model. And obviously, there are more opportunities to dissatisfy than opportunities to satisfy. That is kind of a natural paradigm. And of course, what we will discuss in a session, a couple of sessions later, is about this very powerful process of service recovery, where failure can actually lead to success. But that comes later. Today, let us focus on service quality. So perceived service quality, this block, this is what we are progressing. Our today's session is going to adopt this model, that perceived service quality leads to customer satisfaction, and customer satisfaction is the bedrock for customer preference, which we will then bloom into customer advocacy. Now, the research of Parasuraman and others, which I talked about a little while earlier, showed that the best way to understand customers' perception pre-consumption, expectation, and post-consumption perception. I've talked about these P and E earlier, but today we will go deeper into it. So this customer's expectation or customer's perception, customer expectation before the service, customer's perception after the service, can be understood in terms of 5 factors. These 5 factors are: A, reliability. Reliability is the performance of the promised service dependably and accurately. Example, you receive a e-newspaper to which you have subscribed at the same time every morning or every evening. So that's reliability. Performance on time, the flights take off on time, the flights arrive on time, baggages are delivered on time. These are all factors that are usually connected to reliability of the service, predictability of the service, dependability of the service. The next item is responsiveness. And responsiveness is the willingness to help the customer promptly. An example is that you avoid systems that make the customer go from pillar to post, that make the customer wait without any involvement and get bored, and or wait for no apparent reason. So these are barriers to responsiveness. Responsiveness is where the customer feels good when the customer is in the service flow. The customer feels that people are paying attention, the system is paying attention, and the customer is happy with the interaction that is going on. The next dimensions that we will look at, the next three dimensions are assurance, that is the ability to convey trust and confidence. As for example, being polite and showing respect for a customer. Now assurance, we briefly discussed this when we discussed about the people issues in services management. Assurance means that we want warm, fuzzy, polite, and trust generating, confidence generating interaction from the service provider, which means that we want always nurses should be smiling, they should be very reassuring, they should never get agitated when the patient is agitated, they should actually try to calm the patient down, they should be soothing and so on. This is a tough call because as we discussed when we discussed about emotional labor, if you recall, that though this is what we expect when we are assessing quality of a service, for the service provider, frontline personnel, this is not an easy task. The next one of course is a quality that must be there if a person is working in a service business. This is particularly so as opposed to goods business, because empathy is the ability to see the situation from the other's perspective, the ability to be approachable, as for example to be a good listener, the ability to appreciate the other's pain. So empathy is the ability to get out of your own skin and take on the role of the service customer. This again is often quite difficult, particularly for service providers like doctors or management professionals, consultants or legal professionals, because on one hand they have to keep a dispassionate and a logical frame of mind. If they get too emotionally involved with the patient's pain or the client's despair, then they may not be able to think clearly. So they have to on one hand remain dispassionate, yet they have to give that sense of confidence, sense of trust, sense of involvement to the client. This duality management makes whether empathy or assurance a rather tough call. And then of course there are tangibles, physical facilities and facilitating goods. Now as you see out these 5 factors, things like reliability or responsiveness or tangibles, these are somewhat quantitative, expressible in numbers type of criteria, and therefore we may create some standards by which we will be able to evaluate these 3 factors. But assurance and empathy, it's very difficult to develop scales there. Each interaction is unique between the service provider and the service client. So here we have to rely on the comparative judgment in the client's mind between expectation and perception. So expectations for a service, those are formed by word of mouth from other people, from other customers, from the referrals, from personal needs and evaluation of those needs and matching with the service provider's qualification and capabilities, etc., and past experience with the same service provider. These are the usual 3 drivers that create the service expectation. On the other hand, the service perception happens after the service consumption, and as you see here, these are the three sets of equations we have discussed number of times earlier also in this course, that if the expectations are exceeded, that means perception after the service is much higher than the expectation before the service, then it's a quality serendipity. That means it's a delightful surprise for the customer. If it is equal, it just meets the expectation, then it's an even keel situation. So it is satisfactory, but as you can easily see, therefore, just customer satisfaction is not enough, because if somebody else, a competitor, can provide at this level, then you will be at a competitive disadvantage. So even though you have a satisfied customer, it will not mean a repeat customer. And of course, if the perception after the consumption is less than the original expectation, then it is unacceptable service quality. So conceptually, you see, we are focusing on gap, the gap between initial expectation with post-consumption perception. If that gap is in favor of the perception, then the service is delightful. If it is more or less equal, then you are just satisfied. And if the post-consumption perception is less than expectation, then that service is unacceptable. So therefore, there is no way of winning. So this gap actually can also be expressed in 5 different types of gaps. So gap number 1 is when customer's expectation differs from the management perception. That means what the management feels that this is the kind of bed the customer will find comfortable. This is the kind of room decor which will give customer comfort. This is the kind of food that if served in in-room dining, the customer will feel happy. This is the kind of average service time if we maintain for breakfast delivery in the morning, the customer will be happy. But if that management perception of customer's expectation is different from what the customer feels that the breakfast must be delivered in 5 minutes or 10 minutes in the morning when they are in a hurry, and the management feels that 15 minutes is okay, then there is a gap. This is what we call understanding the customer. The gap is understanding the customer. So this is often we call the market research gap or customer research gap. That means we have not understood the customer's requirement well in depth. And this can, of course, once if this is found, this gap is found, then this can be easily calibrated, because one can find the customer's requirement, one can fine-tune one's process and see that this gap is met. The next gap is called the design gap. The design gap means what the service standards are, that means what the competitive standards are or what the industry standards are. So for example, in airline service, there are some standards of that, you need to report at least half an hour before the service. Now, if some airlines start insisting that the customer has to report 1.5 hours before the flight time, or check-in before 1.5 hours before on a domestic flight, that means you are putting some more pressure on the customer. So that means you are actually deviating from the competitive standard or the industry standard. So this gap between industry standard or competitive standard and your perception of what you are the process that you are setting up is the second gap, what we call design gap. Again, if we find this gap, we can redesign our services. So here, the first gap, the remedy is understanding the customer's need in greater depth. The remedy for the second gap, which is the design gap, is to redesign the service process. We look at the service blueprint, which we have discussed before, try to see how lines can be balanced, try to see how bottlenecks can be removed, try to see how the throughput can be improved, try to see how the waiting time can be decreased and so on, and therefore we can meet this design gap. The third gap is conformance, that is between the service standard and the service delivery. Again, here obviously the solution is conformance. Again, we have to actually relook at our service blueprint, relook at our ever improving service standard in the industry, because all competitors are always trying to do a bit better than before, and they are trying to be one up. So that means you have to constantly keep a track of the emerging standards in the industry, the service quality being made available from other prominent competitors and so on, and you have to manage this conformance. And then the next gap is, of course, what the service is being delivered and what the customer is perceived. Sometimes good service delivery may not actually create that kind of favorable impression in the customer's mind if the communication during the service process is poor, the presentation during the service process is poor. So a good example is that the food that you are serving may be great, but if the crockeries are not proper, or if the presentations are not proper, or if the service personnel are not clean, properly dressed, or they don't appear to be clean, or they don't appear to be using gloves. So these appearances are all part of communication. All these signs and all these symbols are part of the communication. Or the menu design, the way your steward talks about the menu, the consultation that you can have with the steward, or the way the waiter responds to a customer in a hurry. All of these are communication packages, a part of the whole communication system. And if that communication system is not proper, then the service delivery may be good, but the customer perception may be not that good. So there, of course, you have to really focus on the managing the service evidence, what we call all the as I was talking about, the signs, the symbols, the communication, the collaterals, all these need to be improved. And of course, the last gap relates to the customer satisfaction, where if the customer perception is not in conformity with customer expectation. So in a way, all these gaps finally lead to this fifth gap. So this is the famous service quality gap model. So quality can be created by design. That means if you actually want to create a budget hotel, then you make yourself very clear that what kind of domain in which you are playing, and from your website, from the way your details are provided in the various kinds of travel comparative sites, and the way the customer is perceives the service level when the customer arrives or when the customer receives the booking confirmation, that's where actually you can create quality service by design. And the other few things you can do is that you can make certain aspects of the service fail proof. So whether it is in the electrical connections in the hotel room, or the height bar at the amusement park, so that young children cannot go to rides which are not that safe for them. All these are way you can actually create the service and ensure proper standards by the design. A very good tool for this is the famous house of quality. So even though this is called house of quality, it actually does not tell us it is not a tool for quality assessment. It is not like statistical process control or statistical quality control or the ServQual, that's kind of tool. This is actually a design tool. So if we want to know that these are the customer's requirement, that reliability, responsiveness, assurance, empathy and tangibles, to remember it easily, I use this acronym TEAR with a double R, TEAR, TEAR with a double R. This is tangible, empathy, assurance, reliability and responsiveness. So here, if we are comparing, say for example, a particular, this is taken from a famous case, a car dealer, Village Volvo, and comparing them with other Volvo car dealers in Europe. And so these are what the customer's expectations are, and to achieve these expectations, to surpass these expectations from the post consumption perception, one can do investigation and say, okay, it is by training, by developing service personnel attitude, by training them for proper attitude, the capacity determination, information packages, equipment. These are the ways actually we achieve these factors. As you see here, reliability has a high correlation with training. Reliability has somewhat correlation with mid-order correlation with information and equipment. Responsiveness has a high correlation with capacity that you have created for the service. It has some correlation with training. It has some correlation with information. Similarly, assurance has a high correlation with the service provider's attitude, or empathy has a high correlation with service provider's attitude. So this is actually therefore a correlation chart to design service quality in a way that it meets customers' requirements. So as I will repeat, this is not a quality assessment tool, but it's a quality design tool, very simple, very effective, and I would like you to think about this, and then you can try to do some trial. You take up any particular service, like here we have taken up a car dealership service. Similarly, you can take up a restaurant, you can take up an airlines, you can take up a hospital or nursing home, and you can actually see the correlation between these 5 factors and what kind of 5 elements that you will have to. So this is actually what the customer wants. So these are actually all what factors, and these are all how factors. That means how you will achieve what the customer wants. So in this case, in the car dealership, the how answers are training, attitude, capacity, information, equipment. You can actually take up another service and see what will be the how factors by which you will actually meet these what factors. And QFD, there lots of material are available on the web. Excellent tutorials are available on the web, either at YouTube or through Google, and I will request you to go through them and see how you will actually apply. It's a very simple tool, but it's a very powerful tool, and the more you practice and more you use, you will get a hang of it and you will become an expert, and it will really be an excellently useful tool that you can use in your day-to-day management task. In fact, it can be further improved with all these weighted score and improvement difficulty rank, etc. You can also compare it with other competitors and so on. So these are additions to QFD. This is also often called, this house of quality is also often called QFD, quality function deployment. And I will repeat, quality function deployment or house of quality is not for assessment of quality, but for designing quality in the service so that the customer satisfaction happens. Classification of service failures. I will take up this in the next session, and we will start from this particular area. So as the first part of our discussion, please go over those 5 factors that we have discussed: tangibility, empathy, assurance, reliability and responsiveness. Try to understand those 5 factors in terms of the different types of services. Go to the chapter on service quality and productivity in your textbook and read those, and it will be great if you can actually do this exercise. And this is a voluntary, this is not a compulsory assignment, but some of you who will like to do. And by the way, QFD, there are a number of tools available on the web to create this diagram, and so you simply have to fill in the blanks. So you don't have to get it. So on the computer you will get a chart, something that looks like this. And I will say you take up a service with which you are familiar and see how you will actually line up the factors that will help you to achieve this what the customers would want in that service. And those of you who will be doing it, I will be very happy to review them on the forum, post them on the forum. Thank you.